In this lecture, we're beginning two successive lectures where we're looking at what happens in the development of Lutheranism after Luther has established and grounded his Reformation there in the city of Wittenberg and throughout Germany. And this lecture is important. I find for a lot of people, those who learn a little something about the Reformation, it's too often the case that with Luther, our familiarity with him essentially ends either with the Diet of Worms or a little bit after, once we understand where Luther has taken his Reformation at the outset. But the fact is that Lutheranism developed and became entirely complex, and it had a number of issues it had to deal with, even within the context of Luther's own life. But even carrying on after Luther, there are more issues and more fights afoot that shape the context of where Lutheranism will go and develop for centuries thereafter. And one of the things we can begin to note is the surrounding cast around Luther. There are a number of folks there in the city of Wittenberg who really make the Reformation there sing. They take Luther's theology and they put feet under it. At times they get into controversy with Luther and they fight with him. But by and large, the context, the cast of players around Luther, play a pivotal role in shaping his thinking, his descriptions of his faith, and the direction, politically and socially, as to where Lutheranism will go in Germany. Well, the context here of where we pick up from is we're here in 1530, which is just after the Marburg Colloquy, which is where Luther and Zwingli have it out on the issue of the sacraments, and they divide. Well, what happens is the two parties, the two Reformations, the Reformed on the one hand, the Swiss Reformation, and the Lutheran German Reformation on the other, divide. They will never come back together again in any formal way. Now, over the centuries, there'll be those who are in favor of kind of a blending of these two sides. In particular, in modern evangelicalism, there are people who love Luther and the Reformed faith at the same time. Well, this isn't what happens too much, at least in general, there in the context of the 16th century. This split between Luther and Zwingli is vital. It's not simply a split over the sacraments, though of course that's the main issue. What happens, of course, is the split is political and social. Going forward, the German Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation, becomes more, you might say, insular or more unto itself. It no longer, at least for a period of time, seeks allies from the other Reformation wings. You rarely, if ever, see Lutherans reaching out to the Anglican Reformation movement. They certainly don't reach out to the Scottish Reformation when it gets underway later. And, with some exception, they rarely reach out to the Reformed faith. Lutheranism becomes its own context and its own political entity. And we're going to see some of that here. Well, one of the more important, if not the most important person in the surrounding cast around Luther is Philip Melanchthon. Melanchthon really is the codifier, the systematic theologian for the early Lutheran faith. Melanchthon was a German man, just like Luther. In fact, Melanchthon isn't his natural-born name. Philip's natural name was Schwarzerd, a name in German that means black earth, probably indicating something about his family having been farmers or something like this. Well, as Melanchthon carried on and he became more of a humanist, he didn't like the name Schwarzerd, so he Latinized the name to Melanchthon. Melanchthon in Latin, though, is just black earth translated. But to us, ever since, he has been known as Melanchthon. Well, the interesting thing about Melanchthon is he is a bit of a prodigy. He comes from a well-educated family. Melanchthon's great-uncle was a man by the name of Reuchlin, who was probably, we might say, the first real savant, the first real author to commend the study of the Hebrew language to the European world. It's not so much the case that people had forgotten the language, but they really didn't know very much. In certain places and in certain cases, sure, people knew very little, if any, Hebrew at all. But what Reuchlin, Melanchthon's great-uncle, does is he issues the first real serious Hebrew grammar for those to read and learn and study the Old Testament in the original. Reuchlin had come under some fire for this. He had been accused, in particular by the Paris Faculty of Theology there at the Sorbonne, of going against the Vulgate. Bit of a strange argument. They actually argue that the study of Hebrew is either irrelevant or, as many seminary students tend to agree from time to time, the study of Hebrew was a bad thing for one's soul. Well, Reuchlin aside, the context of his family is that they're incredibly well educated. And Melanchthon, therefore, is, again, something of a prodigy. He's phenomenal at languages and at studying of texts, and his writings, for anyone who has read them even in translation, are entirely clear and crystal and sharp, and the way he carries his arguments forward are really very much aesthetically pleasing. That is to say, they're easy to read. Now, anyone who has read Luther will find him not always the easiest to read. Not because he is hard to follow. Very often he's blustering down this trail or down this other rabbit trail, etc. But Luther writes like a rabbit runs. He just goes wherever his pen takes him. For Melanchthon, he is very, very clear and sharp, like all good humanists desire to be. Well, it's because of his background and because of his relationship with his great uncle Reuchlin, as well as his coming over to the Protestant faith, that meant that in 1518, just a year after the posting of the 95 Theses, Melanchthon is appointed a professor of Greek there in the city of Wittenberg. And Melanchthon and Luther become lifelong friends. They are really kind of the odd couple in a manner of speaking. The two of them are close, and in fact, as we'll see later in the Reformation, when Melanchthon began to churn on some of Luther's core teachings, not least of which is on Luther's view of the sacraments, Luther would hear none of it from those who wanted to kick Melanchthon out. So in 1518, he becomes a professor. In 1521, though, Melanchthon issues and publishes one of the most important books for the entirety of the Reformation, and it's known as the Loci Communes. You can still find this in print today. Just a word of warning, the title has not changed. Often you'll see the book titled still the Loci Communes. Sometimes it's translated as the Commonplaces, but even if it has the title Loci Communes, it very well might be an English translation. Loci are chapter headings or brackets or categories for subjects. You might say talking points. Communes just means common or standard. So a Loci Communes, a book by this title, is, you might say, the common topics of theology. It's more of a systematic theology, you might say. And what Melanchthon does here is he actually takes the complexity and the verve and the color of Luther's core teachings on the gospel and on the law and on faith and the sacraments and these things, and he codifies them. He writes them down in a systematic way, really, frankly, for the very first time. And this book is enormously important. Other works of Melanchthon are equally as important as we go forward, his commentary on Romans, for example. But still, the Loci Communes, as the first real codification in very clear categories of Luther's teachings on things, is enormously important for understanding the Lutheran message. Luther blessed it, in fact. It became the standard textbook there in Wittenberg. But it didn't just simply write down what Luther said, it also gave shape and vocabulary to the Lutheran message. To this day, in fact, we talk about the problem of law and gospel. And it needs to be pointed out that that's not the language of the New Testament. Not in that very crystal clear way, law, gospel. There are certainly discussions on the law, and there are certainly discussions on the gospel. But there's no chapter heading, no single verse that says, now here is the doctrine of law and gospel, etc. Well, Melanchthon is the one who really invents this vocabulary, this grammar. The problem of the Lutheran gospel, he says, is the problem of law and gospel. One brings condemnation, it shows us our sin, and the other points us to Christ and the work he has done for us on the cross. In many ways, in fact, if you want to understand Luther, you read the Loci Communes. The 1521 version is a short version. There is another one later that he expands and makes a real seriously thick book. But if you want to understand the early Lutheran Reformation, I always tell people, pick up the Loci Communes and read it. You could probably read it in an afternoon. It's that short. Well, as we fast forward to 1530, after the Marburg Colloquy and after the separation of the Reformed and Lutheran worlds, what begins to happen is all of the political muscle and problems and might and issues that are going on there in Germany and the Holy Roman Empire begin to come home to roost. In 1530, there is issued to another diet, this time in the city of Augsburg, a formula of the Lutheran confession, or a synopsis of the Lutheran gospel in a confessional form. And this is known today as the Augsburg Confession. It is the first Lutheran confession to be, you might say, on the books. Now, it is important. Melanchthon wrote this. Now, Luther blessed it, he liked it, he approved of it, but this is a work of Melanchthon's. The context of this document, though, is the very reason why the Marburg Colloquy came together in the first place. This is a moment where Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is asking for the Lutherans to come and lay their faith before him and tell him what they believe. And so they do. And in very clear terms, in very clear categories, in the Augsburg Confession, there is described not only the Lutheran gospel, which all Protestants embraced, but also a Lutheran view of the sacraments. Now, this will be important because over time, as the Holy Roman Emperor and others are dealing with quote-unquote Protestants, they will often mean by that word Protestant Lutherans. They will not mean the Reformed or any of the other folks out there. Indeed, for a long period of time, for generations, if not long after, when you have a Catholic political entity that is dealing with Protestantism, they're very often only dealing with Lutherans. In fact, even a century later, at the end of the wars of religion, as we call them, when the Catholic forces of Europe and the Protestant forces come together, they actually have to spend some time deciding where the Calvinists or where the Reformed folks are going to fit in, because for all these years they had not been admitted to the table of the discussion politically. And there are other features as well. When Mary Tudor comes to the throne and Protestants begin to flee in droves from England, there's a band that actually lands up in the north in German territories, in Lutheran territories, and they are met, metaphorically speaking, at the docks, and they are asked, surprisingly, at least to new students to the Reformation, what their view of the sacraments is. And when they describe a more or less reformed view of spiritual eating, not physical eating, they are told to get back on the boat and go find some other place to live. So the Marburg Colloquy, again, has political overtones, and it carries this weight for generations thereafter. And a lot of what's going on here is the German Lutheran Protestant princes, people like Philip of Hesse, etc., begin to notice that at some point, when he's freed up from his other squabbles and fights with either France or with the Pope, or at times with the Ottoman Empire, Charles V is going to turn on them and a war would ensue. And during the 1530s, the Lutherans, and Luther himself is instrumental in this, began to develop some new language and vocabulary that they believe will help them defend themselves against the political might that is coming against them to destroy them. And what's in play here is, for a number of years, Luther had always said that Christians, Protestants, are, we might use the word pacifist today. Or another way of probably looking at it is that they might practice civil disobedience in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. did, in which they stand up and say that something is wrong, that they march, that they declare things to be evil. But, and this is important for Luther early, they will not lift a finger to defend themselves, that they are to suffer should the might of the empire come down upon them. Well, here's the thing. Luther changes his mind on the subject, and he particularly begins to do this in 1530 and 1531. Luther moves step by step from an argument that Christians are, again, essentially pacifist, to eventually finding some room in his theology for either self-defense or outright rebellion or fighting amongst Protestantism. Now, this isn't just simply political, this is theological as well, though it will have ramifications for centuries. Because, as we just mentioned, the great wars of religion, the wars that carry on from the latter half of the 16th century on into the first half of the 17th century, these wars, seen collectively, are the bloodiest and the most violent wars that happened before World War I, when we start to see weapons of mass destruction like gas and real serious bombs and tanks and these kinds of things rolling in. In other words, all the wars that happened thereafter pale in comparison to the great wars of religion. Well, in part, those wars are governed by the principles of the changes of policy by Luther and others on this issue of violence. It's a big jump to say Christians must always suffer, just as Paul did, let's say, under the Emperor Nero, etc., to moving from that to the point of saying, you know what, we can overthrow a political entity, or we can defend ourselves with violence. It's a hard question, particularly when you read Romans 13, where Paul says to be subject to the rulers, and he's talking about none other than Nero himself at that point, or certainly the Roman beast of the tyranny of the Roman Empire. How do you move from that to this idea of self-defense on a political stage as Protestants, as a church? Or going one step further, how do you condone violence, active violence, to overthrow those who are tyrants? Well, what Luther begins to change, first and foremost, in 1530, 1531, is he adopts a position that was relatively popular in the Middle Ages, and is the doctrine that has a slogan attached to it, and that is that you may, quote, repel force with force. And what's in play here is simply self-defense, we say today. Luther says, okay, princes, if Charles V comes upon us, we can defend ourselves commensurate with the amount of violence being thrown at us. If he comes with swords and horsemen, well, we can stand up with the same amount of force to get him to stop. And that really is probably the best way to see it. Repelling force with force means if they're coming at you, you attack, you defend, you raise your weapons, you may do bloody violence. But, and this is important, if they turn and flee, you don't chase them down and kill them. And you certainly don't do preemptive attacks on the empire. Well, that's the first step. Eventually, though, Luther will embrace, to some extent, a more activist, you might say, preemptive view of war. That Protestants might seek to take out Charles or some of his armies or take lands by force if the political regime, the political entities deem it necessary. Now, Luther believes he's being clear here that the church itself is not the one fighting. He will never believe that the church should be fighting, but what he's making room for is for the political rulers who are Protestant themselves to defend the church. And what Luther does here is he creates room, creates space for a powerful entity that will come into existence known as the Schmalkaldic League. And the Schmalkaldic League, or the League of Schmalkald, depending on how historians want to call it, is a political entity. It's a really military entity made up of German Protestant princes who have banded together in an effort to repel Charles V, should he come at them with his armies to reimpose Catholicism. Well, by and large, for a great number of the years of the 1530s, there are fights and skirmishes and concerns and a mustering of arms, and then, well, it doesn't quite go to war, etc. That really leaves Lutheranism in the lurch at times. Now, Luther himself is not on the front lines of this, but he is, you might say, on the back lines, supplying moral voice and morale to those who are galvanizing the Protestant legions in order to defend themselves. Now, this is important to note because here's the thing. Too often when we talk about, you might say, the tone or the style of different Protestant traditions, you have a lot of empty slogans, frankly, or empty categories for how we understand the Reformation. I have heard repeatedly, for example, that it's the Calvinists who like to fight and overthrow and do violence and all this kind of stuff. That wherever Calvinism or Reformed theology lands, it tends to be violent and chaotic, and it doesn't mind killing a king, cutting off a head, this kind of a thing, should it mean that they can impose Protestantism. On the other hand, Lutheranism is too often, frankly, described as entirely pacifist, as if it always is pacifist. Well, what's in play here, frankly, is the context of what happened in World War II. Ever since the anemic lack of conviction by the Lutheran Church in the 20th century to stand up and speak against the horrors of the Holocaust or against the German tyranny, people have cast about trying to find what is the root cause of this. Why would the church sit back and say, oh, who cares? We're not going to lift a finger against the prevailing order or the political order. And too often what happens is people say, well, it's because Luther was pacifist and therefore he said no war, no violence, and therefore the Lutheran Church, centuries later, is unable to do anything when it comes to at least speaking out against Hitler and the Third Reich. The problem is one, it's completely ahistorical. Luther actually does galvanize and get in bed with, you might say, the political orders. He embraces the idea of war, and he even goes so far later in his life to embrace the ideas of preemptive or active war. In a manner of speaking, the issue with Luther and the Third Reich and the way Luther is used in later centuries has more to do with the fact that Luther got in bed and entangled his church with the political orders there. It's not that they're pacifists, it's that they become supporters of wherever the government is going. And actually, in the context of the 20th century, in the Second World War, you actually see this in writing. People saying, well, Luther backed the state, and so will we. And that means if the state goes to war, hoorah, let's go to war. And besides, there is more to do with Luther's anti-Semitism, which we'll look at in our next lecture, that really becomes a linchpin, frankly, in the way certain documents and certain teachings of Luther get dusted off and reworked into the theology, you might say, or the worldview of the Nazis. Still, trying to read Luther in the light of centuries later and how he's being used is also a bit unfair to the man. But in this case, he backs war. He says, nope, we are going to support this, and if we have to defend ourselves or even preemptively go after others, well, then so be it. Well, Luther dies in 1546, and there is a bit of a power vacuum, which we'll look at in our next lecture, as to the soul and to the leadership of the Lutheran Church. But when it came to war, when it came to the Schmalkaldic League, the fight continued on after Luther's death. Roughly that same year, about that same time after Luther had died, there was a famous battle, the Battle of Mühlberg. And in this battle, Charles V's army slaughters and dominates the Schmalkaldic League and puts it under its thumb. In fact, in February of 1548, after a near total victory by Charles's army against the Lutheran armies, you have imposed something called the Interim of Augsburg. And the Interim of Augsburg is really a debate or a context, you might say, for the battle for the soul of Lutheranism. What happened was there were people who, when Charles came in and conquered, there were Lutherans who said, you know what, we need to go along with this. We need to kind of bridge our own theology and our own context of the faith with those of our new conquering Catholic rulers. And there were all kinds of fights about this. One of the more important ones was the issue of worship. Charles and his interim were very clear that the Lutheran liturgy and the Lutheran form of worship needed to cease, and that there needed to be a reimposition, a reordering instruction of the church around the Mass. And this becomes a split within Lutheranism. Melanchthon on one side says, we can accept this, we can put up with this for at least for a period of time. Maybe not permanently, but it's not so repugnant, the Mass, that we have to simply be guerrilla warriors who go underground and keep the resistance alive. Better to live another day, he might say. There are others, though, who double down and say, not on your life. We cannot accept the Mass. This, in part, is what the entire Reformation was all about. The Mass is a good work. It's part of the penance cycle. It's not in keeping with Luther's understanding of justification. This fight actually introduces a theological word that we still use today, or at the very least, we still fight about today. The word is adiaphora. Adiaphora is a bit difficult to translate directly, but its meaning, we often say today, is, quote, things indifferent. In a more 21st century tone of voice, we might say these are non-essential matters. The issue of the interim, then, is when they demand that Lutherans accept the Mass and go back to the Catholic practice of church. Is this, quote, adiaphora or not? Is the Mass an indifferent thing? Or is it one of the core essentials of the Protestant message, that we will not take part in the Mass? Now, in the modern world, often the issue of adiaphora, you might say, at least in evangelical contexts, always sort of hinges around the style of worship. What type of instruments, what type of procedures, what lyrics are too light or too heavy? Can we update things? Can we adapt to the 21st century? So on and so forth. But we're still having these fights, always in the context of worship. What are the essentials? What can we not do away with? And what are things that are adiaphora, the indifferent matters? And just to sort of sermonize this for just 2 seconds, it is a vitally important issue pastorally. How do we understand the issues of the essentials and the non-essentials? If you draw a line in the sand over everything, including the non-essentials, well, good luck. You're going to end up having a church of one by the end of your ministry. You're going to be the only person standing. There has to be a concept, Christians have said from the Reformation until today, of matters that are indifferent or non-essentials. Well, this is one of the great contexts of this debate. Is it adiaphora to attend the Mass? Or is it part of the core conviction of the church? In the end, Melanchthon's view that it is adiaphora loses out. And again, in our next lecture, we're going to look a little bit more at the fight and the struggle over who Melanchthon is in the context of later Lutheran theology. As we'll see, he is not exactly a well-liked or well-respected man as the years wear on, particularly after Luther's death. But in this case, Melanchthon loses. The theology, instead of men like Flacius and Chemnitz, very important, very famous names in Lutheran theology after Luther, argue pretty vociferously that the language of the Mass, that its theological and its cultic sacrificial overtones, mean that it's not adiaphora, that you can't simply exchange the Mass for the Lutheran service and call it roughly the same thing. Well, what happens to the Lutheran Church? Obviously, they didn't get wiped out. Well, in a manner of speaking, the Schmalkaldic League fought back. A very important man by the name of Maurice of Saxony stepped into the fray, became really the central galvanizing leader for the Schmalkaldic League, and he actually fights back. There is an important battle and a taking of the city of Magdeburg, and over time they quell and they stymie the armies of Charles. Charles is overextended. He realizes that he is on the brink of an entire civil war there in the Holy Roman Empire. And so very famously, in 1552 and in 1555, there are issued two treaties that will go down in history as two of the most important documents for the cessation of religious violence. Now, neither of these documents carries the weight in its own day for ceasing religious violence, but they're a step in the right direction. The first in 1552 is the Treaty of Passau, and this one is a more immediate treaty about the cessation of hostilities between Charles and the Schmalkaldic League. They lay down their arms and they are no longer going to go to war. In 1555, though, there is issued the Peace of Augsburg, which is, again, a very, very famous document for what it attempts to do, not so much for what it actually accomplishes in its own day. Again, at the end of the Wars of Religion, roughly a century later, they actually look back to the Peace of Augsburg for some inspiration as to how to cease religious violence in Europe. Well, the doctrine that is in play, the idea of the Peace of Augsburg, is encapsulated in a slogan. And I'm going to give you the Latin and then I'll explain it. The slogan is Cuius regio eius religio. It's actually a bit easy to understand if you just look at the two nouns, regio and religio. If you just add an in to both of those, you end up with the English equivalent, region and religion. Cuius and eius are pronouns, they are relatives, and the way they're translated is, to those who have the region, his religion. That's an almost literal wooden translation of it. To those who have the region, his religion. What this does is it compartmentalizes, and it, you might say, regionalizes different faiths, whether Protestant or Catholic. And what it says here is, if a prince owns a region, if he is the prince of this region, if he's the ruler, and if he's Protestant, well, congratulations, if you live there, you are Protestant. If it's a Catholic prince, well, it is now a Catholic region. In other words, what it says is, we'll each agree to disagree, we won't try to kill each other, we won't have one prince or a group of princes seeking to dominate and take over others. It's basically a divide and separate between Protestantism and Catholicism in the Holy Roman Empire. Now again, in terms of immediate implications, it lasts for a while, but eventually everyone goes back to war. In terms of long-term implications, though, and this is important, what ends up happening is there becomes this dawning idea in Europe, particularly as the Enlightenment picks up speed and as people exhaust themselves with the wars of religion. The idea that you're going to totalize one faith over all of Europe ceases to become a real desire or even possibility in the minds of Europeans. They cease, in other words, to believe that there can only be one faith, one Catholic Church, or one Protestant faith that rules all of Europe. Both eventually will lay down their arms, though of course there will be social tensions, microaggressions between one side or the other, and sporadic persecution, of course. This doesn't end violence, but what this does tend to end, at least as the years wear on, is the idea that there ought to be Protestant armies and Catholic armies seeking to undo and destroy one another for the sake of their own faith.